Hey, welcome back, everybody. Of course, you know me. My name is Dr. Keith McNally. This is the Question Guide podcast. And I want to get this right. This is Ghulam Fernandes. And she's going to give us the most impactful story that anybody has ever given on my show because, quite literally, she's going to share how she turned pain into purpose. And so I just want to get into this story, actually. I want you to start talking because this is your backstory, at least the very intricate part of how and why you turned pain into purpose. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm
How do you want
ready.
to get started?
I guess it's helpful to know that in my background, I had multiple losses. This is the short version. I had multiple losses, and I was stuck for years trying to figure out how to cope with them. And now I'm a grief specialist, and I'm passionate about helping other people on their journey. So I guess if that's the overview, people often say to me, Gulam, how did you get into this sort of work? Why on earth would you choose to, work with people who are struggling with sadness and everything else? So that's kind of the
Well,
start.
we can't shorten it that much. And so when we first had a conversation, you did talk about the significant losses. Can you reshare that with our audience today, the
Absolutely.
specifics? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was 13, my mum decided that she wanted to go on holiday, and we'd moved to this country from Pakistan, and something that something that she heard triggered her into wanting to go and visit her family. And maybe on TV or something, she heard that if you died in the UK, they would cut you up and they would put you in a freezer. And she was terrified by that idea. She was a very devout Muslim, and that's a definite no, you bury people straight away and all that sort of stuff. And so she just became fearful and determined to go and visit Pakistan and visit her family. She wanted to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. And people said to her, how can you possibly go? You've got six children, the youngest of whom is 5 years old. I was 13 at that time. And she said, no, my brother's down the road. They can look after each other. We'll take the youngest one with us. She was just determined to do it. And secretly, as children, we were quite happy, actually, because we thought, while she's away, we'll be able to have fun. Lots of people came to see her off. And then just as she was about to leave, I had this sudden urge to tell her that I loved her and to give her a big hug. But this logical part of me popped up, looked around, and said, don't make a fuss. She'll be back in 6 weeks. But sadly, she wasn't back in 6 weeks while she was in Pakistan. She got to go to her Hajj. She got to see her family. But while she was in Pakistan, she got typhoid and she died. And she didn't come back in 6 weeks. So we were really confused because we didn't get to see the body. We didn't get to say goodbye. We weren't be able to be at the funeral. And in those days, we're talking a long time ago, there were no Zoom calls and WhatsApp videos and all that stuff. So obviously we were devastated, but somebody trying to be friendly and helpful, maybe friendly is the wrong word, but trying to be helpful. I remember she leant forward and she said, you mustn't cry. You've got to be strong for your brothers and sisters. You're the oldest girl. And so I believed her. And I spent years trying not to cry every time I thought about my mum and trying to be strong for my brothers and sisters. I mean, looking back now, it seems so ridiculous. Why would you tell somebody who's lost their mother not to cry? But I know that it's a common myth, that, oh, keep busy, be strong, give it time. There are some common myths that we kind of just believe, and then they can get us stuck in grief for a long time. So I struggle with that. And I didn't realize at that time that grief is not only negative, it's cumulative. And so it will just sit there until you actually get around to resolving it and dealing with it. So I got to about age 30, and my older brother died very suddenly from a massive heart attack. And in those days, we didn't really understand about, symptoms of heart disease, or that smoking, lack of exercise, eating fatty food was all bad for you. And he had a stressful job. He smoked like a chimney. He loved takeaways, didn't do any exercise. So not only did he have some underlying metabolic disorder, I think, but his lifestyle didn't help. And when they did an autopsy, they said his arteries were furred up like that of an old man's.
Mm.
So what happened then was that, and he was only a year and a half older than me. So I used to think that old people died and other people died. So all of a sudden, that belief was completely shattered. And all the old grief, unresolved grief around my mum, then also popped up at the same time. And at the same time, my own sense of mortality, I couldn't live in denial that, I'm going to die. Death became very real. And I suddenly developed a fear of death and dying.
Mm.
And in fact, I started getting a nightmare. And in my nightmare, it's as if I've died. I'm going to be judged. And there's like a big pair of scales. And because I was brought up to believe that your good deeds and your bad deeds are being recorded, and then one day you'll be judged and either sent to heaven or sent to hell. So every night when I went to bed, I never knew which was going to weigh more, my good deeds or my bad deeds. And so sometimes I'd wake up sweating and terrified that I was going to go to hell. Other times I'd been a bit better, and it seemed I was going to go to heaven. But that uncertainty of what happens when you die and where are they, I just became very preoccupied with the bigger questions of life. And I carried on trying to be strong for the family, and trying not to cry. But it was obvious to everybody else, although I thought I was doing fine, that I wasn't actually doing fine.
Mm.
And in fact, one of my colleagues very bravely approached me, and she said, how are you getting on? And I said, yeah, I'm doing my best, keeping going. She said, I don't think you're doing fine. She said, I think it'd be really good for you to take some time off. When I actually
Can I
stopped,
ask, let me
yeah.
interrupt, please. Can I ask, did she give you the indications that were about you that caused her concern? What were the things that you were doing, saying? What was your mannerisms? What were the indications? Did she mention? Your colleague mentioned.
So, yeah. So what I've realized now as a grief specialist is that grief emotions can be overwhelming, and you can become forgetful. You can find it hard to make decisions. You can find it hard to focus on getting things done. And you can find yourself getting emotional. Different things can just trigger it off.
Hmm.
And so I think a combination of the impact on my job performance, I imagine, and seeing just, how my emotions were kind of up and down would have been some of the things she would have observed. Even though from my perspective, I thought I was being strong and, keeping it under control.
For many, many years
Um,
too. Yeah. And
well,
I go ahead.
I was going to say, I managed to keep it under control, I thought, although if ever anybody asked me about my mum, I'd suddenly get very tearful and emotional. And then they would say, oh, when did your mum die? And I'd be saying, like, oh, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever it was.
Mm.
And they'd be like, really? Because I was acting as if it had just happened yesterday.
Right.
And that's the thing, because that scene of when she left and when I didn't tell her what I wanted to say was kind of etched in my brain. And every time I thought about my mum, I couldn't see beyond that. I'd get back into that conversation of, why didn't I tell her, why didn't I give her a hug? Why didn't I tell her I loved her? Um, so the thing was, I was coping
Right.
to a point.
Well,
Um,
can I just add that real quickly, please? That
yeah, yeah,
it just, when you were told when you were younger, 13 years old, to manage your emotions and your emotional expression, don't cry, be strong. How consistent for what, and I don't even know why, across culture, maybe across religions, across the globe, adults tell children very much similar things.
yeah.
You've got, and for whatever reason, where is this cliche coming from? You have to be strong. And so it's now frustrating. And now we're in, 2023, and very much the same words, the same thinking patterns are still being communicated to friends, loved ones, and younger ones. You got to be strong. Why, and you may not have the answer to this, but this is really my first question.
Mm,
Why do we communicate these words to other people when it's okay to express emotion? And we expect people to express emotion. Do you have an answer? And you may not, and it's not here I'm not here to trip you up. I'm here to
yeah, yeah.
really investigate.
Well, I think the way I see it is, and I may be wrong, but my impression is that um, we're not comfortable in talking about our mortality and we
Mm,
live in denial. And I think that happens across cultures. So, in the face of good information, education, discussion, um, about grief, what it is, how it impacts you, how you deal with it, we end up depending on cliches, things that have been passed down, things we've seen other people say, or things that we've seen other people do. And so we just because we're in a situation where we're not sure what to say and we don't want to say the wrong thing, so we'll pull out something that we've heard. So I'm sure that the same thing with that lady. I mean, I know she was trying to be helpful, but in the face of good information about what is grief, how it impacts you, what gets you stuck, what are the myths, that's all she could come up with, because
yeah,
that's probably what had been passed down. So I think that's one of the big problems, that somehow people think if they talk about grief, somehow they'll make it, or death. I mean,
right.
death, grief, they're all kind of feel like taboo subjects that people try and avoid talking about, because if it makes it more real, then they'll get more anxious. And so trying not to think about it and just living life as if we're going to live forever is kind of mostly how we deal with it. We learn how to acquire things, but we don't really learn the skills of letting go of things. And
Mm.
that, and I think that's part of the problem.
It's a keen insight. But I want to get back to your story a little bit. So, mom has passed, your brother has passed. Is that the end of your grief?
That's not the
I
end.
know it's not. I'm prompting you for the next step.
Let me carry on. So yeah, so after my brother's death, um when this lady said this to me about time out, I suddenly stopped to think, and I went to see somebody. Actually, I was involved with a lot of new age therapies and approaches, trying to find answers to the big questions of life, because death had become real. And I was like, what's life all about? What's the meaning of life? Is there a creator? What's he like? Where are they now? What happens when you die? All those sorts of things were swimming around my head. And this lady, she said to me, what is it you feel you really need to do right now, to kind of
Oh, I love
um,
that question.
get better, yeah, to move forward or to come to terms with this? And I said, oh, just feel I need to take time out and just reflect and put the pieces back together. And she said, well, that's exactly what you need to do. And I said, I don't feel like taking a couple of weeks off is going to do it. Everything's like so much. She said, well, what is it you really want to do? I said, well, I'd love to be able to hand in my notice, go traveling, and then take as long as I need to get myself back together. without the pressure of I've got to come back to work in a week or two's time. She said, well, that's exactly what you need to do. And I said, no, I can't possibly do that. And she said, well, why not? And in my head, I'd built up this scenario of if I don't have a job, I won't be able to pay the rent. If I don't pay the rent, I won't have anywhere to live. And I pictured myself in my imagination sitting in the gutter, homeless and in a dark place.
Wow.
And she looked me in the eye and she said, is that really true? And I went, no, of course it's not true. I burst out laughing. I said, no, of course I've got family, I've got friends. If I did decide to do that, of course they'd put me up and support me until I got another job and got back on my feet. So with her encouragement, I actually resigned from my job and I decided I was going to just go where my heart led me, really. And I bumped into some people who were going to India to stay at an ashram. And I'd never been to India before, but they said I could tag along. And I thought, maybe that's what I need. So I decided to do that. But then sadly, I found out that my younger sister had a delayed grief reaction. She was very close to my brother, and she had actually put on an amazing performance of being strong. And we thought she was doing the best out of all of us, that we were falling apart, but she was doing really well. But sadly, she went on holiday, and while she was there, she went into a coma. And they did lots of tests, and they found out there was nothing, no infections or anything. So they thought, oh, maybe it's some kind of mental thing. They flew her back. She was on holiday at the time. And she was admitted to a mental institution so they could do investigations. And they found out that she'd actually had a nervous breakdown. And what had happened later on when she came back to being herself, she thought that she had died. And she was very confused. She was hallucinating about who was alive and who was dead, and that she could see my brother. And it was all very confusing for her.
Hmm.
So I suddenly didn't know what to do. Should I go? Should I stay? What shall I do? Anyway, while I was trying to decide, she came back to being herself, and she said, no, of course you must go. You really need to take this time out. And I said, well, maybe I should take you with me. But I'd never been to India, and I didn't know what the facilities would be like if she had a relapse. So I thought, well, and then I said, okay, I won't go. I'll cancel my trip and I'll just be here for you. And she said, no, you really need this. You need to go. So I said, okay. And she said, I've got family here. I'll be okay. So reassured, off I went, and I was traveling for about 3 months. And then I got a message saying that she'd had a relapse. I stayed at various ashrams and explored all kinds of things, trying to find answers. Anyway, she apparently had a relapse. So I got a message saying she's had a relapse. It'd be good for you to head back, because she'd started trying to take her own life.
Hmm.
And become depressed. And so I thought, okay, I must phone her and let her know I'm heading back. But sadly, I just couldn't get through. In those days, you had to phone the local exchange, you would phone the main exchange, you would phone, it was very complex. So again, my logical part popped up, trying to be helpful, and said, you'll be there tomorrow. Don't worry about it. You'll see her tomorrow. But sadly, between me leaving Mumbai and landing in London, she walked out of the facility, and this time she succeeded, and she had died. And she was almost 21, a
Hmm.
beautiful young woman. It was such a waste of life. And so that really threw me into a spin, because I was like, what if I didn't go? What if I'd taken her with me? What if I'd insisted on making that phone call and persisted till I got through? So those are sort of examples of some of the ways that you can get stuck, when you've got some unresolved issues, some regrets, or wishing you'd done things differently, or you've done them better, or you've done more of them.
You
So I
carried
think
guilt with you.
um, definitely lots of regrets,
Regrets.
and
Okay.
so much guilt, because I felt like I'd done everything I could while I was there. and she had improved and she was doing well. There was nothing to indicate that she'd have a relapse. But there were regrets. I kind of found myself, what if I didn't go? What if I had taken her with me? What if, so those are the three main ones. What if I had, tried to phone her more often from India and check in on her? Um, because
Now,
I had been
that's
feeling
a
much
lot.
stronger.
So you're dealing with a lot of grief, regrets, and you're in a space mentally where you're trying to figure things out and make sense of quite literally the world and your place in it. Right now, your world doesn't seem that safe or that good. Does it get better at this point?
Well, the thing is, being away, I had started to feel calmer, stronger, and feeling I was, getting a sense of myself back. And then this happened. So it was like another blow.
Okay.
And so, fortunately, although I had been back, so when I got back, I didn't feel, I thought, right, I'm ready to tackle life. And then I came back, and then there was this blow. And then I was like, I'm not ready to tackle life. But fortunately, before I left, in order to raise the funds, I used to do freelance training, and I was an equal opportunities training officer. And so when people heard I was back, and in order to fund my trip, people had said, "Oh, do you know somebody who can do X training?" And I was like, "Yeah, I can do that." As far as I'm concerned, if you can teach, you can teach it. The content isn't so important. So I think it was a report writing course that actually funded my trip to India. But when I was back, they said, "Oh, you're back. We've got some more training courses." So before I knew it, I ended up becoming a freelance trainer because I didn't feel ready for a 9 to 5 job. And then one contract led to another, and so on. But sadly, about a year later, again, just as I was kind of finding my feet and thinking, yeah, okay, I need to move on, my father died. And but this time it felt very different because he was again going on holiday, and I thought, I've had all these bereavements where I had regrets about not saying goodbye, not telling them I love them, wishing I'd. So this time I'm going to make sure I say everything that needs to be said. And we had a very volatile relationship, my dad and I, because apparently I was a very stroppy young lady growing up, very strong opinions and so on. And my poor father, he'd been brought up, to believe that your children should do as they're told immediately and cheerfully. But I somehow had picked up the idea of being in the UK that you always ask why. So he'd say, "Okay, I want you to do X." And I'd go, "Why?" And then he'd get frustrated and infuriated. So I thought I need to settle all those things with him in case something happens, and make sure he knows I love him, make sure I've said goodbye just in case you know. And as it happened, we got a message saying he's not well, and then another message saying he's really serious. We've had to take him to the hospital. And then another message, another phone call. We're not sure how long he's going to last. You better try and come as fast as you can. So while we were running around trying to get visas, we got another message saying, "We're really sorry he's died, but you better hurry up because we can't keep the body long without burial because of the heat." So fortunately, we did manage to get there, not in time to say goodbye to him, but in time to be at the funeral. So it's interesting that with each of those losses, there were different characteristics that kind of made it either harder or easier to move forward. So although obviously there was all the grief and the sadness, it didn't feel as stuck because I had expressed everything and I'd made sure he knew I loved him. I didn't have any regrets about things that were unsaid or that things that were undelivered. So I suppose with each grief event, although it sent me into a spin, it also taught me a lot. And in all of this, it kick-started me into exploring the meaning of life and faith and God and everything.
Well,
And the answer wasn't 42.
well, this is what I would like to do if it's okay with you. We spent a good amount of time sharing the backstory, the the grief elements, and the regrets and the frustrations, and your verbalization of how you've had to deal with that. What I would like to do with our conversation is to put this in two parts. Is let's stop here. Let's give the audience a time to reflect on what you've said, and let's come back at a later time, literally and figuratively, and then talk about how you took that pain and created purpose from it. How does that sound?
That sounds really great. And one thing I'd love to say before we wind this up is that sometimes when people hear about what I've gone through, they start getting very concerned about if I'm okay and how I'm coping and so on. So I just need to let people know that having come through, I am really fine. And now I want to be a beacon of hope, that it is possible to come through that amount of sadness and grief and live a life that's well lived and a life of purpose. So I just want to reassure people that I'm doing really well. That's not to say life is always easy, of course not, but that they don't have to be concerned about my well-being and welfare.
I do appreciate that. So let's go ahead and end this conversation and pick it up again. This is part one of, and I want to get the name right, Ghulam Fernandez. Yes,
You did very well,
I
yes.
appreciate that. And your story of turning pain into purpose. This has been another edition of the Question Guy podcast, and we will see you next time. Take care.
Yeah, thank you.